In this video, we're going to talk about the CSS Position Property and the related directional properties that go along with it. Before I get started, let's see what we have. I've set up an HTML document with an article in it. The article contains an H1, several paragraphs, a section with an H2, and several more paragraphs. Then in our CSS, we have the article. We've applied a background color so we can see it. We've used a little margin with the auto keyword to center it horizontally on the page. We've given it a little max width and a little bit of padding. And then in the section, we've given it its own background color and a little bit of padding just so it'll stand out. So let's see what it looks like in the browser. Here we can see we have our article and our section within it. So I squeeze things in and out because we use max width that rescales and centers. So the first thing I want to point out is that we know by now that block elements in HTML span the whole width of their container and that they stack starting at the top of the page and moving down the page or down the container. And inline elements, of course, have their own default behavior. They sit side by side like words in a paragraph, and they wrap when they run out of space on a line. And this default behavior, the way elements position themselves on the page with regard to the other elements around them, and the way they follow that default behavior is called document flow. So, for instance, this paragraph sits where it is because it has a number of paragraphs and headings before it, and they all have taken up their own amount of space. And so, this paragraph, being a block element, stacks below the H2. That's its position in the document flow. So we just call that concept document flow. And what the position property in CSS allows us to do is mess with or even completely remove an element from document flow. So let's take a look. I'm going to come in here, and the thing we're going to mess with is this H2 right here. This is differential geometry. Here it is on the page. So if I go into the CSS, I'm going to select for that H2. And I'm going to apply a position value of relative. Now, if we look at the page, we can see nothing is different. The H2 is still sitting exactly where it normally does in document flow. Nothing has changed. And so by applying a position value, we're basically telling the element how to behave, what rules it should follow when behaving. But to actually move it around, we need to combine it with these directional properties. The directional properties are bottom, top, right, and left. So let's just try top for rem, and we'll do left to rem. Let's see what happens. So here's our H2. We can see that the place it originally occupied in the document flow is still there. There's a gap where it used to be. But what's happened is using those directional properties, it's been pushed down from the top for rem, because that's what we put for the top, and it's been pushed in from the left to rem, because that's what we put for the left. So basically, we can say that elements that have position relative keep their position in the document flow, but then the directional properties push them based on that initial position. If we change this to bottom for rem, then it's being pushed up from the bottom from its initial position. So it is here instead of down here. But its place in the document flow is still there. This gap where it used to live is still present. So basically, position relative just gives us a way to nudge an element while keeping its place in the document flow intact. The next value we're going to look at behaves a little differently. This one is position absolute. And let's try combining that with top to rem, and we'll do left to rem. So the first thing to notice is that the H2's position in the document flow is now gone. It's been removed from the document flow, and no gap remains where it used to be. So where is it? Well, if I scroll up to the top, I can see it's at the top of the page. It has been positioned with regard to the page as a whole. It's been pushed in to rem from the left of the page and down from the top to rem from the top of the page as a whole. And so we can say that the absolute value takes an element out of the document flow and positions it with regard to the page as a whole. So what do you think is going to happen if I change this from left to rem to right to rem? It moves it over to the right of the page as a whole and pushes it in to rem from that right edge. If I start changing the size of the page by changing the size of the browser, we can see that it always occupies that same spot, 2 rem from the right edge of the page. And notice that as we scroll, this scrolls along with the page because it's part of that page. This is important. I want to show you another related thing about position absolute, which is that if we throw a background color on here, and I'll use light sky blue, we can see that for an absolutely positioned element, the background color is only as big as it needs to be to contain the content. But we can actually kind of combine these properties, these directional properties, to expand it. So right now, the whole thing's 2 rem from the right. If I combine that with left 2 rem, it's going to try to honor both of those at the same time. It wants to be 2 rem from the left and 2 rem from the right. So it's going to stretch the element across the page to try to do both. And you can take advantage of this in certain situations. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And we'll put it back on the left. So it's at the top left of the page. Remember that when we applied position absolute, it removed this element from the document flow. So as far as its container, the section is concerned, the H2 was never in there. But in some cases, you actually want to position an element absolutely within its container, not within the page as a whole. And so to do that, basically what we have to do is tell the container to act as that referent or that parent. So on the section element, if we look in our HTML, we can see that the H2 is inside of this section. If on this section element, we apply position relative, it will now act as the container for anything inside it that is positioned absolutely. So remember, this is position absolute, 2 rem from the top, 2 rem from the left. But now it is 2 rem from the top and 2 rem from the left of the section, not the page as a whole, because that section is position relative. Remember, when we use position relative, it doesn't take an element out of the document flow. And without those directional properties, left, right, top, bottom, it just stays exactly where it normally would have been anyway. So, appearance wise, the section doesn't do anything differently, but it acts as that container or that referent for the H2, which is positioned absolutely because it is position relative. It's important to know that this isn't just for direct parents. This works for any grandparent or great grandparent or any ancestor. So, if I put a div around the H2, but we keep that section position relative, it still works exactly the same. So the item that is positioned absolutely, in this case the H2, just looks up the tree. It says, hey, is my parent positioned relative? No. Well, is my grandparent positioned relative? And it keeps going up the tree. If any ancestor is positioned relative, it'll position itself with regard to that ancestor. If no ancestor is positioned relative, a position absolute element will position itself with regard to the page as a whole. So that is position absolute. There's one more value we need to look at. This one is position fixed. And we can see here that the element has still been taken out of document flow. So just as with position absolute, there's no longer a space here where the H2 used to live in the section. But we can see that the H2 is positioned from the top and left of the browser window. But because it's the browser window and not the page, it stays in place as we scroll the page. And as we resize that browser window, it sort of sticks itself to that window. Think of something that's stuck to the window in your car that stays in place even as the content outside of your car seems to move. That's what fixed is. And so we can position it in other places with regard to the window. So if we do bottom left, it's going to sit here at the bottom left of the window and it's going to stay in place as I scroll. And if I shrink down the size of the window, it's still going to stay in place as I scroll. So that is fixed. It positions itself based on the edges of the window itself and stays in place even as the other content scrolls. So just to review, document flow refers to the default way that elements position themselves within a page based on their block or inline behavior. But we can mess with that using the position property. We can do position relative, which keeps an element where it originally was in the document flow, but allows you to use the directional properties, left, right, top, or bottom, to nudge the element in one direction or another from its original position in the document flow. Then we can use position absolute. Position absolute takes an element out of the document flow and positions it with regard to the page as a whole. So you can use your directional properties to position it on the top, the bottom, the left, or the right of the page as a whole. And it will scroll with that page as you scroll. Or you can put position relative on one of the ancestors that contains the element that is positioned absolute. And then the absolute element will be positioned relative or with regard to that ancestor as its parent. Finally, you can do position fixed. Position fixed takes it out of the document flow and positions it with regard to the window, the browser window, so that you can position it with the directional properties on the left, the right, the top, or the bottom of the browser window. And it will stay in place even as the content within the browser scrolls, as the user scrolls through. That is position fixed. So that's the CSS position property and how it works with the directional properties top, left, bottom, and right. These are fairly niche properties. You shouldn't be using them for everything, but for certain things, they can be very, very useful.